It's smaller than a grain of sand, round, glossy, layered like a tiny jawbreaker. To the naked eye, it isn't even visible, just part of the dust clinging to a piece of fabric. But under a microscope, a single sphere of paint like this one helped confirm the identity of one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Decades after the crimes, and years after investigators had already searched his house and let him walk away. This is a story about trace evidence, the science of things so small that most people never think to look for them. And why, sometimes, the smallest piece of evidence in the room is the one that closes the case. Trace evidence forensics rests on a single idea, articulated over a century ago by the French criminologist Edmond Locard. Every contact leaves a trace. Brush against a wall and you leave fibers behind and pick up flecks of paint. Sit in a car and you exchange material with the seat. The exchange is often invisible, but Locard's insight was that invisible doesn't mean absent. It means you haven't looked closely enough yet. Paint is one of the most useful materials in this field for a reason that sounds almost too simple. Paint is everywhere. Cars, tools, walls, furniture, machinery. Nearly every hard surface in the modern world is coated in it, and every coat of paint carries a chemical and physical fingerprint of where it came from. An abstract fingerprint waveform overlays a painted panel as microscopic particles pulse along the contour lines, making Locard's exchange principle visible in motion. Automotive and industrial paint isn't one substance. It's a system, typically applied in multiple layers. A primer, a color coat, sometimes a clear top coat, each with its own chemical formulation. When forensic analysts examine a paint chip, the first thing they look at under a microscope is that layer structure. The number of coats, their thickness, their exact sequence of colors. That layering is often enough on its own to narrow down a paint sample to a specific manufacturer or even a specific model year of vehicle, because paint formulations change over time and differ between companies. From there, analysts can go deeper, using instruments like infrared spectroscopy to identify the chemical binders and pigments in the paint, essentially reading its molecular recipe. Two samples with the same layer structure and the same chemical signature are treated as coming from a common source, or, at minimum, a very small pool of possible sources. And when investigators are lucky enough to have a broken edge, a paint chip that flaked off a surface, leaving a matching gap behind, analysts can attempt what's called a physical fit, fitting the torn edge of the recovered chip against the damaged source like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. When the edges lock together, that's about as close to certainty as trace evidence gets. In the early 1980s, the bodies of young women and girls began turning up along the Green River outside Seattle and in wooded areas nearby. The man responsible would go on to kill dozens of victims over roughly 2 decades, evading identification for so long that the case became known simply by the river where his first victims were found, the Green River Killer. Investigators built an enormous case file: hairs, fibers, tire impressions, thousands of pages of interviews. One name kept resurfacing over the years: a truck painter named Gary Ridgway, questioned multiple times, searched under warrant in 1987, and even given a polygraph test that he passed. But nothing collected during those years was strong enough to charge him, and the case went cold. What almost no one realized for nearly 20 years was that the proof had likely been sitting in an evidence locker the entire time. When the original crime lab processed clothing recovered from the earliest victims, a pair of jeans, a purple shirt, a black knit sweater, analysts made a practical decision. With overwhelming casework and limited resources, they chose to focus their trace evidence analysis on hairs and fibers, the categories of evidence historically most likely to produce a match. That decision meant something else went almost entirely unexamined: the finer dust and microparticles embedded in the weave of the fabric itself, material too small to register as a finding under the microscopes and methods the lab was prioritizing at the time. The lab's own trace evidence supervisor later acknowledged that these finer particles were never analyzed during the original investigation. This is a real and recurring tension in forensic science. Labs don't have infinite time or budget, and choosing where to look is itself a forensic decision. one that can determine whether evidence sitting in the room ever gets found at all. By 2001, DNA technology had advanced enough to analyze degraded genetic material that older methods couldn't process. Detectives resubmitted decades-old evidence, and this time DNA from Ridgway's saliva was matched to biological material recovered from several victims. He was arrested and charged, but only in connection with a handful of the murders DNA could directly link him to. Dozens of other suspected victims remained legally unconnected to him. To build the fuller case, prosecutors brought in outside forensic specialists. Among them, a trace evidence expert named Skip Palahniuk, whose lab had previously worked on the Unabomber investigation and the Atlanta child murders. His job? See if the physical evidence collected decades earlier could still tell them anything new. Palahniuk's first approach, comparing paint chips directly, turned up nothing. So he changed methods entirely. Instead of looking for visible chips, he vacuumed the dust from the victim's clothing and Ridgway's own clothing, capturing the microscopic debris too fine to see with the naked eye, and examined it using an infrared microscope capable of identifying a particle's chemical composition from almost nothing at all. Buried in that dust, he found them. Tiny, glossy, multicolored spheres, dozens of them on some garments, in blue, green, red, orange, and white. Spherical paint particles like these typically form when spray paint is applied in a fine mist and droplets dry midair before they ever land. A signature of industrial spray painting, not a car crash or household paint job. Chemical analysis identified the paint as a specific glossy acrylic urethane product manufactured by DuPont, sold commercially under the name Imran, a specialty industrial paint that the manufacturer confirmed had a unique, patented chemical composition unlike any other paint on the market. Identifying the paint's chemistry was only half the job. The other half was tracing where that specific paint could have come from. And this is where trace evidence stops being just chemistry and becomes investigation. Palahniuk determined that this particular paint wasn't sold to the general public in the early 1980s, and in the Seattle area, it was used at large industrial scale by essentially one employer, Kenworth Truck Company, the same company where Gary Ridgway had worked for years, spray painting truck cabs. The spheres turned up not just in the dust from several victims' clothing, but in the dust from Ridgway's own clothing as well. None of the victims had any documented connection to a paint shop or a truck manufacturing plant. The one common thread running through the evidence was the man who spent his workdays spraying that exact paint. The lead prosecutor on the case later described the paint evidence as, in some ways, even more persuasive to a jury than the DNA match that had first led to Ridgway's arrest. Not because it was more scientifically certain, but because it told an intuitive story anyone could follow. These women had no reason to have this rare industrial paint on their clothes except through contact with someone who worked with it constantly. A jury doesn't need to understand genetic sequencing to grasp that logic. Confronted with the new charges built on the paint evidence, Ridgway's defense began negotiating. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Ridgway agreed to confess in detail to every murder he could remember and lead investigators to the remains of victims who had never been found. Ultimately admitting to 48 killings, expanding a case that had formerly solved only a handful into one of the most complete confessions in American criminal history. No one at the original crime scenes could have seen those paint spheres. They weren't hidden. They were simply too small for the methods being used at the time to catch. It took a change in technique, a specialist willing to vacuum dust instead of searching for visible chips, and the patience to trace one unusual chemical signature back to a single workplace. That's the quiet lesson trace evidence keeps teaching, case after case. The most damning piece of evidence in an investigation isn't always the dramatic one. Sometimes it's smaller than a grain of sand, sitting in an evidence bag for 20 years, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough.